Welcome back to BeFM Drama, where we turn great literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and today we're bringing you part 2 in our 5-part adaptation of The Six Napoleons, a classic Sherlock Holmes story from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Holmes has been engaged by Inspector Lestrade to investigate a strange series of burglaries targeting plaster busts or sculpture heads of Napoleon. But what began as an absurd and amusing story has turned darker, as murder has been committed at the site of the latest robbery. Join us now as Holmes questions a terrified witness to the crime that has taken place in his home. The shaken journalist, Mr. Horace Harker, launched his story about what had happened in his house the night before, while Sherlock Holmes listened attentively.
It all seems to center around that bust of Napoleon, which I bought for this room about 4 months ago. I picked it up cheap from Harding Brothers. A great deal of my journalistic work is done at night, and I often write until the early morning. I was sitting in my den at the top of the house at about 3 in the morning when I thought I heard a sound downstairs. I listened, but it wasn't repeated, and I convinced myself that they came from outside. Then suddenly, about 5 minutes later, I heard a horrible yell, the most dreadful sound, Mr. Holmes, that I've ever heard. It will ring in my ears as long as I live. I sat frozen with horror for a minute or two. Then I grabbed my stick and went downstairs. When I entered this room, I found the window open and noticed at once that my bust had gone from the mantelpiece. Why any burglar should take such a thing I can't imagine, for it was only a plaster cast and of no real value whatever.
How utterly fascinating, Mr. Harker. Please continue.
I found the front door unlocked, rushed out, and nearly stumbled over a dead man, lying there on my top step in the dark. I lit a lamp and saw the great gash in his throat and blood streaming down the steps. He lay on his back with his mouth horribly open. I shall see him in my dreams. I had just time to call for help, and then I must have fainted, for I knew nothing more until I found the policeman standing over me in the hall.
Well, who was the murdered man?
There's nothing to show who he was. You can see the body at the mortuary, but we haven't identified him. He's a tall man, sunburned, very powerful, not more than 30. He is poorly dressed, but does not appear to be a laborer. A horn-handled knife was lying in the pool of blood beside him. Whether it was the weapon which did the killing, or whether it belonged to the dead man, I don't know. There was no name on his clothes, and nothing in his pockets but a shilling map of London and a photograph. Here it is.
It was evidently taken by a snapshot from a small camera. It showed an alert, sharp-featured man with thick eyebrows, a dark complexion, and an angry expression. Holmes studied it carefully.
And what became of the bust?
We had news of it just before you came. It has been found in the front garden of an empty house in Camden House Road. It was broken into fragments. I'm going around now to see it. Will you come?
Certainly. I must just take one look round.
He examined the carpet and the window.
The fellow had either very long legs or was a most active man. It was no mean feat to reach that window ledge and open the window. Getting back out was comparatively simple. Are you coming with us to see the remains of your bust, Mr. Harker?
No, I must try and make something of this, even if the other newspapers are ahead of me. Just my luck, to be late on a story when the murder has been done on my very own doorstep.
As we left the room, we heard his pen scratching quickly over the paper in his notebook. The spot where the fragments of the bust had been found was only a few hundred yards away. For the first time, our eyes rested upon this figure of the great emperor, which seemed to raise such frantic and destructive hatred in the mind of the unknown man. It lay scattered in splintered shards upon the grass. Holmes picked up several of them and examined them carefully. I was convinced, from his intent face and purposeful manner, that at last he was on to a clue.
Well?
Holmes shrugged his shoulders.
We have a long way to go yet, and yet. Well, we may have some suggestive facts to act on. The possession of this worthless plaster bust was more valuable in the eyes of this strange criminal than a human life. That is one point. Then there is the singular fact that he did not break the bust in the house or immediately outside the house.
He was rattled and anxious after his encounter with the murdered man. He hardly knew what he was doing.
I have no doubt he was agitated, but I wish to call your attention very particularly to the location of this house in the garden of which the bust was destroyed.
Lestrade looked about him.
It was an empty house, so he knew that he would not be disturbed in the garden.
Yes, but there is another empty house just up the street which he must have passed before he arrived at this one. Why did he not break it there when every second increased the risk of his being seen on the street, bloody from the murder, with the bust of Napoleon in his arms?
I give up.
Holmes pointed to the bright street lamp above our heads.
He could see what he was doing here and could not in the other garden. That was his reason.
By Jove, that's true. Now that I come to think of it, Dr. Barnicot's bust was broken not far from his desk lamp. Well, Mr. Holmes, what are we to do with the fact?
To remember it. What steps do you propose to take now, Lestrade?
The most practical way to make progress is to identify the murdered man. That shouldn't be too difficult for Scotland Yard. Once you've learned who he is and who he was associated with, we'll have a good chance of learning what he was doing in Pitt Street last night, and who it was who met him and killed him on the doorstep of Mr. Horace Harker. Don't you think so?
No doubt, but it is not quite the way in which I would approach the case.
What would you do then?
Oh, you must not let me influence you in any way. I suggest that you go on your line of investigation and I on mine. We'll compare notes later.
Very good.
If you are going back to Pitt Street, you might speak to Mr. Horace Harker. Tell him for me that I have made up my mind that a certain dangerous, homicidal lunatic with Napoleonic delusions was in his house last night. It will be useful for his article.
Lestrade stared.
You don't seriously believe that?
Holmes smiled.
Don't I? Well, perhaps I don't, but I am sure that it will interest Mr. Horace Harker and the subscribers of the Central Press Syndicate. Now, Watson, I think that we shall find that we have a long and rather complex day's work ahead. Lestrade, I would be most obliged if you could make it to Baker Street at 6 o'clock this evening. Until then, I would like to keep the photograph found in the dead man's pocket. It is also possible that I may have to ask you for your company and assistance tonight if my chain of reasoning proves to be correct. Until then, goodbye and good luck.
Sherlock Holmes and I walked together to the High Street, where we stopped at the shop of the Harding brothers, where the bust had been purchased. A young assistant told us Mr. Harding would be absent until the afternoon. Holmes's face showed his disappointment and annoyance.
Well, well, we can't expect to have it all our own way, Watson. We must come back in the afternoon. I am, as you have no doubt guessed, trying to trace these busts back to their original source in order to find something that may account for their remarkable fate. Let us make for Mr. Morse Hudson of the Kennington Road.
A drive of an hour brought us to the picture dealer's establishment. He was a small, stout man with a red face and a peppery manner. Morse Hudson was more than willing to talk with us.
What we pay taxes for, I don't know, when any ruffian can come in and destroy one's goods. Yes, sir, it was I who sold Dr. Barnicot his 2 statues. Disgraceful, sir. A nihilist plot, that's what I think. No one but an anarchist would go about breaking statues. Red Republicans, that's what I call them.
Who did you get these busts from?
I don't see what that has to do with it, but if you really want to know, I got them from Gilder & Co. in Church Street, Stepney. They're a well-known house in the statue trade and have been for 20 years.
How many did you have?
3. 2 and 1 or 3. 2 of Dr. Barnicot's and 1 smashed in broad daylight on my counter.
Holmes showed him the photograph taken from the murdered man.
Do you know this person?
No, I don't. Wait. Why? Yes, I do. It's, Beppo. He was an Italian craftsman who made himself useful in my shop. He could carve a bit, and gild, and frame, and do odd jobs. The fellow left me a week ago, and I've heard nothing of him since. He was gone 2 days before the bust was smashed.
With this new information in hand, we left the establishment.
Well, that's all we could reasonably expect from Morse Hudson. We now have this Beppo as a common factor in both Kennington and Kensington, and that is worth the 10-mile drive. Now, Watson, let us make for Gelder and Company of Stepney, the source and origin of these busts. I shall be surprised if we don't get some help down there.
With that, we've come to the end of this episode. Join us again tomorrow as Holmes and Watson continue their investigation into the origin of the Napoleon busts at the center of this tale in part 3 of our adaptation of the Six Napoleons here on BeFM Drama.